I will tackle the blog module. The setup is very similar as for the reviews module I did in last video. There, I started with the data models, seeded some dummy data, built the business logic to fetch this data, set up the minimal API endpoints and ended with the front-end components. I already did all that for the blog module and I'll briefly go over the extra requirement. I'll end this video with a special requirement, which is writing the blog post in Markdown and then rendering it in HTML. Let's start with a few things I changed since the last video in the reviews module. As you can see in the get testimonials folder, I have this functional component, but now also the section, the row and the card. So you can choose which to use in your own implementation project. I did add the API exception filter and validation filters. And let's head over to the blog module. So as in last video, I started with the database project, modeling the data, which is blog post, inherited from the auditable entity for the primary key and the metadata fields like created at. And then we have a few fields, as you can see. Body as Markdown, I will talk about later on in the video. Is pinned is just an extra. Slug will most definitely want. Post type, just to distinguish, is it a blog post, a newsletter, article, portfolio project, a job listing, maybe some paid content, you name it. Categories and tags are many-to-many relationships with the blog post. So a blog post can have many categories and many tags, and categories can have many, so multiple blog post tags as well. And then that own type author, like you saw with the reviews. Then the rest of the project of the module contains more or less the same API, just 2 endpoints, features with 2 features. Get blog post by slug is one I added and I'll talk about in a bit. And then shared SPA has those same 2 features and a component for each, the HTTP client, the blog state, and then an extra Markdown editor, which I'll talk about later on. Let's first take a look at the blog posts. So some seeded data, blog post 13 to blog post 1, ordered by the created at descending. So I removed the body from the display because that was too much. Let's go to a detail page. So that now, because I already loaded the blog posts, that is just coming from the state. But let's say if I refresh the page, I also want to be able to fetch that specific blog post by slug from the database. So to do that, I followed a similar strategy in the HTTP client. So I init the selected blog post, which first looks in the loaded already fetched blog posts. If there is one already stored, then we're just going to return that. We'll set the selected to the stored one. Otherwise, we'll fetch it from the API over HTTP. Very, very similar. And then the barebone component for get post, blog post by slug, just has, if there is a selected blog post, pass that on to the component that will use this barebone component. Let's see, on parameter async, so when the slug is set, if it's null or white space, we don't want to do anything. If there is a valid slug, we want to get that selected blog post either from memory or from the database. And then you see the body, which has some markup, some styling. This is a bold, this is an inline code block. This is an H3 title, if I'm not mistaken. But I didn't write any HTML to the database. What I did instead is I wrote Markdown to the database. Markdown is a markup language, like HTML is a markup language or XML, but it's very minimal, easy to learn, allows me to focus on the content rather than on the layout, and it's pretty popular for writing README files on GitHub repositories or some code documentation like I do in my own project, for example, to do migrations on my DB context. I put these instructions down in Markdown language since it's so easy and it will give me a nicely rendered preview. If this was written in HTML or XML, I'd probably have a harder time modifying it. And I might get sidetracked by the layout, aligning things and so on, instead of focusing on the content. As you can see in this preview, so these two hashtags are translated to an H2 title, so to an HTML H2 title. And you'll often see the Markdown being translated to HTML. The cool thing about this is then the previewer or the implementation website can still decide on the styling and the layout, since Markdown is only focused on the content. So you can also use links and images and even some tables, but it's rather limited to a simple one column layout. So how is this relevant to the project I'm building? We'll have to write blog posts, and to write blog posts you can either use a rich text editor, which likely also translates the input to HTML, or as developers we could write HTML ourselves. But as I mentioned, then we might be more focused on the layout rather than on the content. So we'll use Markdown for simplicity and to focus on that content, and I will then use a converter to convert that Markdown into HTML. So to do that conversion, we'll be using a NuGet package called Markdig. And it will allow us to simply call to HTML, pass in some Markdown. So now we can write blog posts in the same way like we wrote the README files or documentation pages in our local IDE and with a nice preview. It might become more of a challenge to write it locally and then make sure it ends up in our production database, but that's a challenge for later. I did add a demo. So what you see here is HTML, but converted from Markdown. So we have an H3 title, some inline code blocks, then a multi-line code block. You can see that by inspecting it. You see the pre and then language C#. All the code is there. A link going to Google, the image, the dummy image I put there. And then underneath I made a large text area where I actually entered the Markdown. So that's the H3 title and then the backticks for those inline code blocks. And then this multi-line code block, a link. So with the title and then the URL and then an image with this exclamation mark, which will first have the alt text, so a bit like the title, and then the location of the actual file. So just writing that will give us a nicely rendered HTML. It's not the best text editor, but Markdown is so simple that you don't really need very advanced things. So because of the two-way binding. Now you see this title of C#. Can just .net. It's .net. So maybe that's a possibility for the future to just, or at least copy over our local README, our local Markdown file and copy the contents into this text area, or upload it or something, and then hit the submit button to then publish our blog post. So of course the first thing would be to install that NuGet package of Markdig, then import it using Markdig. Then I'll show you the Markdown editor, but it's similar code in the blog detail page. So this markup string cast comes from Blazor itself, and this can basically render HTML code, like a string containing HTML code, to be output as HTML. But our content is written in Markdown, so first we need that markdig.markdown to HTML method to convert that into HTML, which will then be rendered thanks to this markup string. And down below you see the text you just saw in the text area for the demo. So this would be what ends up in the database, this Markdown. You could also store the converted HTML if you rather have that. And so that Markdown conversion to HTML is what you see in the body detail. So that seems like a solid way to write our blog posts instead of having to write the HTML entirely. There's one more issue with this, and that is the code snippets don't really look like code snippets. For that we can use another package, either color code, which is a NuGet package, and then you have highlight.js, so that's JavaScript, and Prism.js, and then probably some other, and that's basically going to make your code snippets look more like these code snippets that you see. You can probably choose the theme and so on. I'll make sure to include that into the project before I publish the code. So now that I can fetch the dummy data from the database for the blog posts as well, I can start improving the SEO using metadata tags on the page, on the blog detail page, for example. And I'll likely want some pagination. Then we can start the metrics. I've already made a video about metrics and the SEO, and also about pagination. The only difference with the pagination will be that I'm now using Mapster instead of Automapper, so that will be interesting to see in the next video. And once those are out of the way, I might just only add the CAPTCHA for the newsletter subscription form. And maybe I can then style it to my brand styling and put that first MVP version online. So make sure to subscribe to follow the other videos as well. And let me know what you think up until now. Am I going too slow, too fast? Are there more specific things you want to see me cover? I'll definitely touch on the .NET 8 identity, but that might be later. So stay tuned. See you in the next video.